I'm Rob Vanderlyke, a U.S. Army veteran, and I'm here with retired Army Chaplain Colonel Janet Horton.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of a three-part series of discussions of helpful, healing scriptural passages for those who have concerns about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The scriptural passages we'll refer to in our discussion are from the Judeo-Christian tradition. But persons in any other faiths would also be able to find equally inspiring scriptural passages in their sacred text. Today, let's take a fresh look at PTSD through the lens of the first of a number of biblical accounts that have encouraging spiritual insights on how to prevent PTSD, or passages that would promote healing progress for anyone who either is facing or struggling with this frequently discussed challenge. In this day and age, that may include service members, fire and rescue workers, police officers, victims of crimes, or inmates in correctional facilities. May also include those who had challenging times in their early developmental years that felt as if it made a mark on them, and that they too might benefit from those same insights. We're going to look at some alternative perspectives and faith-based inspirational ideas right out of the Bible and how they can be applied in real-life situations. It would seem that the list of events endured by characters throughout the Bible were pretty daunting. Most folks today would certainly wonder, why didn't they show any signs of PTSD? It's encouraging that not one of these biblical figures was broken by such serious deprivations. Today, we can look at what prevented that from being the case and why they showed such amazing perseverance and inspiring attitudes.
PTSD is frequently considered by many to follow extreme situations of emotional stress and trauma. The answer, historically, was either not to talk about it, or worse, at times in history it was wrongly considered cowardly. Our hope is to speak more intelligently, compassionately, and helpfully about it. Today, we would seek to understand the way faith and understanding of spiritual precepts leads to the prevention of or healing of this significant challenge. As people try to think through these issues, they realize there are things we don't know about this challenge. We each have to ask ourselves individually, do we agree with those things about PTSD that are assumed to be true? In War Torn, an HBO special, General Ray Odierno noted nearly 1/3 of troops experienced PTSD. However, that also meant that we could understand that for 2/3 of our troops, that was not the case. A Washington Post article on September 6, 2002 cited 2 studies that raised doubts about the value of the common practice called trauma counseling. Shankar Vedantam, the author of the article, questioned that practice, saying, for some, trauma rehearsals and debriefs often don't help, and that they may harm some person's mental health. He stated that although shock and grief were normal reactions to tragedy, that a more sensible policy would be to expect normal recovery. He suggested that it was inappropriate to recommend blanket requirements for debriefs that recall the incidents. He notes that debriefs can often and do create additional distress among those who may be coping just fine. He suggested waiting a few weeks until the majority of resilient people recovering on their own can be separated from those who aren't getting better.
We need to recognize how individual recovery is and how often people recover with the loving support of family, friends, and coworkers. Each person has to determine by the guidance of their own conscience, or many would turn to God to direct them, as to which of the varying solutions they'd seek. Some want more than just the prospect of merely coping with their days. Many want healing. Relying on prayer is attractive because it doesn't include long-term drug dependency. Treatment through healing prayer may be feasible and desirable for many persons of faith. Some things in life are easy, but some things in life are complex and may require more of us. We'd love to think it was as simple as purchasing a tonic, or that it just wouldn't require that much of us to get through something considered traumatic. It also isn't that we can simply be saying, well, I'll open my scriptures and read a passage and see if in 15 minutes or less God does just what I ask him. God is infinitely more than a big ear in the sky, waiting around till we might finally find a need to seek a higher power. He can't be fooled because he's omniscient. But the good news is he is omniscient. He does know what's on a man or a woman's heart. The Bible assures us, seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. Striving to enter in may be a necessary element among a number of helpful attitudes and stances of the heart. Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, has a helpful insight on this in her book Miscellaneous Writings. She notes that Christianity is not merely a gift, but it is a growth Christward. That's page 253. If we look diligently to spiritual sources, such as our scriptures, they really teach and support the possibility of recovery and help us identify the productive steps of normal recovery and resiliency.
The Bible encourages everyone to, quote, be strong and of good courage, dread not, nor be dismayed, end quote. The Psalms address nearly all the joyous or challenging things people experience in a lifetime. Psalms 9, verse 9, assures us that the Lord also will be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. Many Psalms uplift thought and remind persons of faith that God is present with them in the good and the tough times.
The Bible speaks of preventative measures as well as healing ideas for persons seeking God's protection. A Christian may have a long history of putting on the whole armor of God. One form of putting on the whole armor of God is living a life that is holy and cleansing to the soul and spirit. Many scriptures record how protected those who prayed, worshiped, and followed God's teachings, found these assurances and precepts, prepared them, and then protected them in situations that required things considered far beyond human strength, endurance, and stamina. The Bible truths can be our constant companion if we study the Bible and remember what its guidance was to people in similar situations. Anxiety and fear are repeatedly addressed in the Bible. John 14 says, "Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." There are about 150 references in the Bible to fear not or don't be afraid. So there's no limit on the appropriateness of starting with that recognition in nearly any demanding situation. One of the foundational concepts is to start with the rock-solid recognition that if we feel God's presence with us, it quiets fear because we realize we are not alone.
Mary Baker Eddy, in her book Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, spoke of looking closely at a deeper spiritual way of preparing ourselves and our thought for such challenges. She writes, quote, "When infringing some supposed law, you say that there is danger. This fear is the danger and induces the physical effects. We cannot in reality suffer from breaking anything except a moral or spiritual law," end quote. She is encouraging people to understand that doing our duty and performing moral acts of courage and loving our neighbor in stressful times can't harm us because the good in human character is a spiritual armor for us.
The first time I considered seeing what I could learn by searching the scriptures to see what it teaches about how people who had been through terrifying, unusually long and demanding situations came through those events, what I noticed was striking. First, you could hardly name a prominent biblical figure who didn't go through extreme and or life-threatening situations. Moses, Joseph, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel, David, the apostles John, Peter, and Paul were repeatedly threatened, arrested, beaten, and imprisoned. Paul was additionally in a shipwreck and attacked by a viper. And yet, the Bible doesn't record or teach that there was a trend or even a necessity for these people to suffer or be damaged by these extreme, drastic, or cruel life experiences. If we examine and study those passages, they reveal some very encouraging truths. It's very common for persons of faith to turn to the sacred scriptures as an authority on the issues of life. They are considered sacred for the very reason that in times of need, the Word of God has comforted, inspired, guided, encouraged, corrected, redirected, and spoken to people in all ages, and provided an answer of peace. A foundational characteristic I identified in my search of biblical characters was that without exception, these people we will examine were no strangers to prayer and regularly studied the scriptures. Like some folks listening, they were persons of faith who often began the day turning to the Word of God to inform their way ahead and to guide their steps. They realized with God's direction, they could begin the day on a holy note. A friend of mine found that other police officers were so inspired by his calmness and effectiveness as a new member of the force that they wanted to know if they could read the cards with Bible passages they saw him read before he started every shift. They saw the power of the Word and wanted to look more closely at the truths that had been making such a difference in his performance and endurance.
During this first session, we'll focus on 4 Bible figures, Moses and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Let's begin with Moses, who was placed in a river in a small ark of bulrushes as a baby. As a young adult, he killed an Egyptian who was viciously beating a Hebrew slave and had to leave his home or be killed himself for doing so. Yet God knew of his redeeming goodness and directed him to return to Egypt and take on a momentous endeavor. The Bible describes carefully how God prepared him for this by having him turn aside to see how a bush could burn but not be consumed. He needed to understand how fiery experiences wouldn't have to burn him in the future missions God had for him. He had to understand that those very experiences would more profoundly represent points in his life when he would actually stand on holy ground because of what he would learn about God, the great I Am, who is everywhere and every when. He would also learn about himself as a child of the one divine Creator, his Heavenly Father, and bow only to God's will for him and the people. God also assured him he wouldn't be doing these greatly demanding missions alone, and just the reverse, that certainly God would be with him every step of the way. It was also a foundational recognition for Moses that he could depend on God to take care of every detail of the tasks that God would require of him. God told Moses he was to road march the Hebrew people through a desert without any normal human support systems for 40 years. As they leave, Pharaoh changes his mind and sends the Egyptian army to hunt them down and kill them. Because of their obedience to what God told them to do, he does indeed save them all from the enemy troops. God parts the Red Sea and enables them to walk through the deepest of waters they would encounter as people. And yet, despite that saving grace, Moses' fellow road marchers later turned on him when the demands stretched out over such a long deployment in the desert. By our current standards, they went through harrowing and long-term deprivations in the desert. When it appeared the oppressive desert environment had no food for them, God supplied their every need. God was never absent and would always be with them to meet whatever needs presented themselves. Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, agreed with the scriptures when she avowed that constant toil, deprivations, exposures, and all untoward conditions, if without sin, can be experienced without suffering. Whatever it is your duty to do, you can do without harm to yourself. And that's from her book, Science and Health, page 385. People in service to God, and certainly those in faithful service doing their duty in our country's military, are supported by God as much as Moses was, and can successfully perform their duties.
Despite all of these deprivations, character challenges, extraordinary demands, and betrayals, the Bible closes its narrative on Moses by highlighting the fact that Moses lived to be 120 years old. It adds the detail that his eyes weren't dim and that his life force had not abated. The Bible tops off the effectiveness of his holy purpose by affirming that no prophet ever arose in Israel that compared to him. He was completely protected from any adverse effects from his extreme service duties.
We can learn a lot from this account of spiritual endurance and protection. Moses always turned to God and never thought it was merely human effort that met the needs. He always put God first. He revered and obeyed the commandments that God had allowed him to be the vehicle for presenting them to his people. They may have seemed to many merely a restrictive decalogue of thou shalt nots, but Moses understood obedience to them meant that they would be infinitely blessed for doing so. He helped the people see that they'd be blessed when they loved God supremely, worshiped God, didn't commit murder, didn't steal from each other, and were faithful to their spouses. Equally, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, a group of role models, went through considerable character attacks and were set up to be seized by soldiers who threw them into a fiery furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal. This Bible example highlights how important the support of friends and family are to those who are figuratively going through the fire in our world. These 3 young men refused to worship a golden idol. When confronted about their refusal to bow to a golden idol or yield to King Nebuchadnezzar's decree, they fearlessly responded truthfully and bravely. They showed how absolute their faith was in God. They stood together as friends or family would. They didn't desert each other in what would be considered a life-threatening situation. They stood together on the solid precept that the one God whom they served was able to deliver them even from a burning fiery furnace and out of the furious ruler's hand. In these dire circumstances, the state of the Hebrews' hearts and minds were the diametric opposite of Nebuchadnezzar. They were calm and spoke respectfully, but with authority about the power of God. They showed no fear because of their absolute faith that God would deliver them, and didn't attempt in any way to resist or to harm those who were ordered to harm them. This was in striking contrast to the king, who the Bible describes as being in such a fury over their refusal, ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than normal. His anger, rather than intelligent leadership in this dire situation, harmed his own soldiers who were ordered to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace. The flames flared so excessively, there was an inappropriate collateral damage. The flames killed the soldiers who were ordered to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace. Yet when the holy trio was thrown bound into the furnace, the outcome was a clear example of their rock-solid, consistent piety. They prayed and walked together through the flames because the human bindings or restrictions simply fell away from them. They moved through the ordeal so calmly and with such faith that those who looked on noted they didn't walk alone. The form of the fourth walking with them was like the Son of God. It so impressed their ruler that Nebuchadnezzar called them out, and everyone publicly acknowledged the fire had no power over them. Their clothing was intact, and they didn't even have the smell of smoke on them. They didn't have the smell of smoke on them because of the purity of their heart and mind. They weren't resentful or angry. They just walked on through what was required of them, always keeping their focus on their holy purpose. The good learned from their prayer and closeness to their scriptures was an armor that protected them. Some might doubt and say this couldn't be true today. However, when I shared these insights in an Army sermon, a man approached me and shared this with me. He said he worked in a furnace-type environment. He said he slipped and fell into a large vat of burning embers. He was up to his armpits in the embers. That's when he too turned to God with all his heart and with all his soul and listened. He heard God say that he could depend on him, and he was with him. He heard God tell him to put his hands on the top of the embers and push himself out of the vat, and that he could not be harmed. He did so, and contrary to what physics and natural science would have dictated in the material world of fiery ashes, he lifted himself out and hadn't a single sign of burns on him. He told me that today and after the sermon, he felt he now understood his obedience and trust in God had saved him. I agreed, and he thanked me and asked if he could give me a hug. He felt only joy as the results of that experience. That would have been considered dangerous and damaging. He felt no physical or emotional damage at all. Mrs. Eddy also noted on page 454 of Science and Health, the understanding, even in a degree of the divine all-power, destroys fear and plants the feet in the true path. I myself learned about 10 years before that you didn't have to fear being harmed doing your duty. In basic training, going through the tear gas chamber was considered pretty similar to going through the fiery furnace. I had heard war stories of those who had experienced the toxic effect of the gas on your eyes and breathing. The year before, I found I was absolutely terrified about doing it. I knew I needed to pray diligently to quiet the fear that was overcoming me. When I spent some time praying about what to pray about, I felt led to study the Bible story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Moses experiencing a bush that burned. I also studied a chapter on how to pray to stop animal magnetism, an old world name for hypnotism, in our denominational textbook, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy. I made a commitment to study these passages once a day for 2 months. They were so inspiring that I found I would sometimes look at them as frequently as 3 times a day. I followed the example of the Hebrew slaves who showed moral courage and faced the fire, and I prayed to be obedient as Moses was. I saw how these holy people faced these opportunities as a holy opportunity to grow even closer to God. By that summer, I forgot why I had started the study. It wasn't until I was walking into the gas chamber that I remembered why I had begun the study. All the prior servicemen that helped the cadre were in my group. The officer conducting the drill threw a lot more gas crystals on the fire, and the gas cloud became very thick in the chamber. They warned our group, "You thought you were going to get off easy because you helped us, but we're really going to get you." I was immersed in the joyous thought I'd done my prayer, and I'd get to do this now. I had no sense of fear. A phrase from Science and Health that encourages you not to be hypnotized by the repetition of bad things held in front of you came to my thought. Mind science is wholly separate from any halfway impertinent knowledge, because mind science is of God and demonstrates the divine principle, working out the purposes of good only. And that's from page 103. That was precisely what I needed to understand for that moment. I knew God governed the universe as divine love, and he never had ordained a law to harm or inflict his children. I felt God's presence with me. I knew I couldn't be separated from him. It was as if he were my armor and protective shield from any harm. I felt like I was looking down on the experience, wholly separate from any human sense of being in the chamber. I felt a clarity of thought as I heard a Bible precept that my life was hid with Christ in God. We were told to remove our gas masks. Because the gas was so thick, even the prior service guys were choking and blinded by the density of the gas. They were literally in a pile attempting to get out the door. I stood still and calmly said all of my information. Once the instructors had pulled the men apart, they were able to get the door open. I hadn't left the chamber because the cadre hadn't given us the order that we could leave. One of the cadre, a major, walked back in. He had his mask on and stared at me just standing quietly, unmasked. I was reveling in gratitude that I had no reaction to the tear gas. Finally, the instructor said through his mask, "Humor me and go outside." Once we were out the door, he took off his mask and said, "I have to ask you a question. What were you doing in there?" In complete joy, I replied, "I was praying." After a silence, he said, "That's really something. You know, I've been here for 4 years, and I have never had a single class when not one person got ill until now. I was even more grateful for that. Your prayer is rarely ever limited to only your own needs. It often blesses the people around you, and they too don't have some of the anticipated sickening effects." Mary Baker Eddy also affirmed that whatever it is your duty to do, you can do without harm to yourself. That's page 385 of Science and Health.
In our second session, we're going to consider what the Bible truths are that protected Daniel, who was literally thrown in a lion's den and came through that extremely unusual trial without any harm, and showed a calm and wise demeanor through the entire experience. We will also look closely at what enabled a young shepherd boy to represent his country in a one-on-one military battle against an experienced giant warrior from Philistia that would determine the outcome of all the people's lives in those nations. Our third session will consider the Apostle Paul, who, like many of the early Christians, was threatened on multiple occasions, beaten and thrown in jail. He also survived a shipwreck that totaled the vessel, and everyone ended up in a storm in the ocean on pieces of the ship, swimming to the shore without what we now have, maritime life preservers. Navy and Marine service members may relate to their experiences even in very literal ways.
Thanks so much for joining us, and we hope you have an opportunity to join us for our Session 2 and Session 3.